about 20 sometimes because it's always well, it is a sacred place. It's got mystical qualities to it. And so one Christmas, this Oatom guy who had enlisted in the Army and made a career of it in order to, does it sound like a familiar refrain, support his family, right? Was deeply troubled by what he was doing. He was a ranger, and he'd been sent to El Salvador as part of an advisory group to advise the military and government of El Salvador. So he came back and he wanted to talk to me, and he was morally and spiritually deeply troubled by what he was doing down in El Salvador in the 80s. And so I said to him, well, the kids and I and some friends are going to climb Baba Kiveri. I think it might be helpful to just spend some time up there. And he agreed, so we went up, and it turned out I had a wedding that night back in Tucson, and so I said to him, well, I'll put up the climb. Toward the top there's a little technical climb of about 120 feet. You have to take ropes up and put up the ropes for the climb and the rappel down. And then once I put up the climb, I have to get back down with my kids because I've got this wedding tonight in Tucson. And so I'm back at home, and I get this call about 10 o'clock that there were two guys still up on the mountain and that the circumstances were that they'd come down the rappel and they'd counted heads, and one guy was missing, and they didn't know whether he'd come down and gone on ahead or whether he was still up on the mountain behind him. So Mike, this guy from Special Forces, and another guy had volunteered to go back up and make sure they hadn't left him on the mountain. Well, of course, darkness hit, and they had to stay up on the mountain, and so we started up the next morning to get him, and they were coming down, and on the way back down they said, well, you guys built a fire last night, didn't you? And I said, no, we stayed in Tucson. We weren't going to come up here in the dark to find you guys. We didn't come out till this morning. And they said, well, about 11 o'clock last night we saw this large fire down on the saddle, and we was sure it was you guys coming back up to get us. And we said no, and they said, but we've been the whole way down the trail and nobody else is on the trail, nobody else was on the saddle. Who built that fire? And I said, well, it wasn't us, and we didn't see anybody when we were coming up, so there's nobody else on this mountain. And everybody kind of scratched their head and didn't have any explanation for it. So when we got back that afternoon, I called up an old Oatom elder that I knew, and I said, I'm just going to tell you a story about what happened on Baba Kiveri yesterday. And so I told him the story, and there's kind of a silence, and he said, we know what that is. And I said, what do you mean you know what that is? And he gave a word in Oatom that I can't pronounce, and he said, it means the fire that moves. And he said, our people see that whenever we're in trouble or we're anxious or we need some reassurance, that fire appears to us. He said that's what he saw up there. And so I called Mike and I told him the story, and it was pretty transformative. He had already reached the possibility of retirement and said, well, that's it, I'm out of here, I can't do this anymore. And he retired from Special Forces and came back to the res.